you're ready. Hi, oh, we on? All right. Hi, everyone. We're going to get going here. So everyone, let's get settled in. My name is Michael Wagaman. I am a demographer that's been hired by the city to help them work through this process. I'd like to emphasize that I am a consultant here. I'm not the decision maker in this process. I'm the facilitator really hired to help the city, its community, its elected officials work through this process. So as we go through this meeting today, keep that in mind. And when we get to the Q&A, if you have thoughts about how the lines actually should be drawn based on the information here, it's going to be really important that you get that testimony submitted so that it can be reviewed by the full council. So that means either there will be, as I show you, there's a dedicated email account that's been set up for this. It means coming to the next meeting of the City Council, which is next Tuesday, or otherwise submitting testimony as you would for any other item being considered for the city. Show of hands, who was at the City Council meeting a couple of weeks ago when we talked about this before? So for all of you, some of this first part is going to be repetitive in that we're going to go through redistricting 101, as I call it again, to kind of introduce the concepts that are going to govern this process. I will note that a lot of those are sometimes a little complicated, so some of that might have been a lot to take in at the first meeting, so it'll be your second chance to absorb that information. At the end, I'll introduce just a couple of new pieces of information we have picked up to add to the process, and then we'll have Q&A. Again, Q&A should be primarily about, okay, I didn't understand that concept. What are those things? How would that work? Those kinds of issues. If it's actually testimony about how the line should be drawn, that's, again, where the testimony is going to be helpful to submit. I'll note that here there are packets in the back. One of those materials in there is a packet to submit your community of interest testimony and define here's my community of interest and why it's important it should be kept whole in a district. All of those materials are also on the website, so if anybody is not here physically or doesn't have that packet or loses their homework, you can download it from the city website. So with that, walking through briefly the timeline where we're at here, we are now on to December 4th. We've had one public hearing. The schedule you see above you is actually not entirely driven by the city. It's spelled out in state law. And what the state law basically says is you have to have 2 hearings before you draw lines, and then you have to have 2 hearings after. Why does it do that? Because it says you shouldn't be skipping ahead and automatically talking about what lines should go where. You should give the community a chance to have input before people start actually trying to divide up the city. So that's deliberate, that process in the law. Your city has gone a step above what's required in law by adding an additional meeting before drawing lines, which is why we're all here. So they are not only meeting the law, they're exceeding the law. Moving forward with a timeline that'll have maps basically in place but drawn by the end of January, with the ordinance adopted in February. If that seems very fast, it is. Again, that is not something that is necessarily in the city's control. That is a timeline that is spelled out in state law. And so that is why this is moving forward in a rather rapid fashion. One thing I will note is these are to draw lines that will be used for your 2020 elections. There will be a census in 2020. There'll be new census data that will come out in 2021, at which point you'll get to do all this again. So that timeline will allow for a longer timeline under state law, so won't be quite as rushed when you get to revisit those lines in a couple of years. What is districting? Fundamentally, it just means that instead of everybody voting for everybody, so everybody votes for all 7 council members, everyone will now have a district where only the people in that district get to vote for that person and only people who live in that district get to run for that office. So everybody, instead of everybody voting for everybody, 1/7 of the city will get to vote for one person, fundamentally. That said, there are lots and lots and lots of ways to divide up any jurisdiction. So the districting process is really about making decisions about how those lines should fall. One thing we say when we talk about redistricting is it involves trade-offs. And we'll walk through some of what those trade-offs look like. But doing one thing may make it harder to do something else. And so it involves prioritizing which of those things is most important. It's not necessarily a right-wrong answer, though the law does give some guidance in certain places, but it is a place where, again, the community, your elected officials can provide guidance as far as what way of dividing the city works best for its citizens, for its population. The statistics above you see on the screen here show both the population, the voting age population, meaning those who are over the age of 18, and the citizen voting age population, which is the closest that the Census Bureau comes to defining eligible. First thing I'll note here is that when you're talking about drawing district lines, you're talking about the population. So you're not talking about voters, you're not talking about eligible voters, it's people. That is coming from the Supreme Court, that is the standard we are talking about here. So we're talking about that 90,000 number when we're talking about whether the districts are of equal size. The other thing I will note there is that that population data is from 2010. That is obviously not reflective of some of the changes that have come in the city in the last 10 years, particularly some of the recent population changes due to the disaster. But unfortunately, that is the most current population data we have. So that's what we're going to be using for this process. Again, when the lines are redrawn in 2 years, you'll have a more current census. They can look at some of the data to try to figure out where higher population growth is in, but ultimately for determining if the districts are of equal size, again, we're going to be stuck with that 2010 data. The other data here, the reason you may see that ethnic, or actually I'm going to skip ahead here. So what we're going to do here is we'll walk through the law and the criteria, then we'll talk about the geography and the data, so what are the building blocks we're going to use, and then we'll talk about how the process is going to move forward. Relevant laws, you kind of see listed here, we'll walk through them, starting at the top with the U.S. Constitution on the federal level, working their way down through federal law, state law, and then some of the many lawsuits that have been filed as relates to redistricting and how the courts have given jurisdictions such as Chico some guidance. As I was talking about, first thing is districts should be of approximately the same size. This is the famous one person, one vote. If you've heard that phrase before, that's where this comes from. It doesn't, however, mean absolutely the same size. So it doesn't mean it has to be exactly that ideal size of 1,000 or 12,889. It's not have to be exact, but you want to get as close to that number as you can. And when you're not there, you want to know why. So you want to have a justification for why. Generally, the courts have said, though this is a little less true than it used to be, that if your districts are within 10% of each other, meaning the largest district, the smallest district, so roughly plus or minus 5%, that is generally something where the courts have said you're safer there. That's safer ground. If you go beyond that, the courts start applying a much more strict standard of scrutiny on stuff. So, but the easier, safer rule is just get as close as you can. When when you're going over or under, you have a reason why. And again, 2010 data. Race, and this is where things start getting a little bit more complicated, because we all know the whole reason we're going through this process is the California Voting Rights Act, which generally tends to favor having district elections versus at-large elections, which is explicitly about race. It explicitly says you're looking at the impacts on protected classes and whether there's racially polarized voting potentially going on in the jurisdiction. That said, even though that's the reason you're starting this process, the courts have also said that race cannot be the predominant factor in how you draw the lines. So that doesn't mean it can't be a factor. It can't be something that comes up, but it can't be we're drawing that lines because we're explicitly because we want to keep everybody of this particular group all in the same district. Now that said, there are places where race can come into the process, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. California Voting Rights Act, again, as I talked about, is primarily not about how the districts are drawn. It's about drawing districts. The one nuanced part where the California Voting Rights Act does come into play is that it does say in the whatever districts that are drawn that tend to have the densest concentration of the protected class, which in the case of Chico is our Latinos, that district should tend to go first. So it would say that district should tend to vote in 2020 versus 2022. So it speaks to sequencing. It doesn't talk about how those lines are drawn. It's just talking about who gets to go first. California Elections Code, what I'll note here is this is the election code as it currently is written. The legislature just passed a significant amendment to this elections code that has not gone into law yet. I show this version, A, because it is in fact the current law, and B, it's shorter and easier to read. That said, the new changes to the law don't change the fundamentals of what you see, which are what are called traditional redistricting criteria, is the coin of art, or the phrase of art. Lost my train of thought. So, and I'm going to try to save questions for the end, but we'll do that. So again, but for the California Voting Rights Act, it doesn't again speak to how you draw those lines. So it doesn't say you have to put you should try to draw a district for Latinos or anything like that. It just says that once you've drawn those lines, you should look at where those communities are, and the districts where they are should tend to vote earlier than later. So they should vote in the first available election. The Federal Voting Rights Act, which is a different law, does speak to how those districts should be drawn. However, the U.S. Supreme Court has said that you have to meet certain criteria for the Federal Voting Rights Act to apply, one of which being that you have to draw a district where the protected class makes up more than 50% of the citizen voting age population. It does not appear that that's possible in Chico. Therefore, the Federal Voting Rights Act is going to have a much smaller impact on your redistricting process. So again, these traditional redistricting criteria you see on the screen, and we'll walk through these. A lot of these will make kind of like no-duh sense to people, but we'll walk through them. The first one being contiguity. Literally all that means is every part of the district should touch another part of the district. So if you see the map on the bottom there with that red district, you see it's got the one part that is not connected to the other parts. That's non-contiguous. You shouldn't do that. As with most things in redistricting, there are exceptions, and there is an exception here in Chico in that you have the water treatment facility that is non-contiguous to the rest of the city. So that has to be attached to something. It will obviously not be contiguous to the rest of it because there's unincorporated land in between, in the way. But as a general rule, every part of the district should touch every other part of that district for all 7. Compactness, there are law professors, political science professors who love to write very long, very complicated papers to describe what compactness means and come up with fancy formulas for it. Fundamentally, this is kind of the eye test, though. Like, does the district look normal, or does it look like the infamous gerrymander, where that's where a lot of times that applied, is people are looking at compactness as that what they're referring to there. So you can see on the ones on the left are more, for lack of a better term, squarish than the ones on the right. So that's why the ones on the left would generally tend to be considered more compact than the ones on the right. As I mentioned, the legislature just amended California law, and they put a slightly more nuanced definition of compactness in there, where it just basically says, don't bypass another population. So that means, I am closer to you, I shouldn't skip past you to get to her, that kind of a thing. That's all that means. Notably on compactness, this is usually what kind of people appeals to people. Again, when you look at the way the legislature is amending the law, they're moving compactness down on the priority list. So they're saying do some of this other stuff is more important than compactness. So what are other reasons why wouldn't you want to just draw a bunch of squares? One example is topography and geography. So those same pretty districts that we had earlier, if you imagine you see that light blue line running through them, Imagine that's a river that has no bridge over it. Suddenly those pretty districts don't look as good because you have people on either side of that big river being put in the same district, even though there's a big physical landmark in their way. Notably, those kind of barriers do not need to just be natural. They can be man-made. So for example, in the picture on the right, you can see Big Chico Creek going one way. You can see the freeway going the other way. Those are examples of both man-made and natural pieces of topography that the city council and the city may, emphasizing may, want to consider in putting together boundaries. Doesn't mean it has to, but it's those kinds of things that the law says you should look at and at least consider. Communities of interest, this is where I will say the public can have the biggest impact in the process, particularly in this stage before we start drawing maps. Because what is a community of interest? It's basically fundamentally who are the people who should be put together for purposes of representation. So communities of interest can be defined lots and lots of different ways. Common culture, common educational institutions, common economic institutions, common shopping, common, whatever it happens to be, common language, all those kinds of things can come into what is a community of interest. The challenging part is that there's not a fixed database necessarily of communities of interest. I can look and find all your roads and find all your rivers. Communities of interest are harder to define, particularly because communities of interest can be overlapping, right? You can have a student area that may have lots of other neighborhoods that overlap with that area. And so which one is more important, particularly when those boundaries don't necessarily align with each other. The other thing is communities of interest can evolve. So what once was a neighborhood could expand or shrink depending on how development, how people move, all those kind of things. They are not fixed objects like a river. So as you can see in the example, our compact boundaries, again, if you can kind of see the orange boundaries and the orange dots, imagine that's a community of interest. If that was all drawn into one district, they would be a majority of that district, right? So if you just drew a box around those orange dots, but as the lines are drawn here, they've been split up into 3 different districts, so they can't, and they aren't a majority in any of those districts. So that would be an example of a community of interest that would be negatively impacted if those lines were in place. Again, that's where the public testimony is really important, is saying, here are the places you need to look for. Here are the building blocks that are important to keep whole as you start defining boundaries. Again, in the packets in the back of the room, there are opportunities to identify your community of interest. Those same materials are on the city website. Excuse me. So now what we'll do is now we kind of lay down what are the laws that govern this process. We'll talk about what are those building blocks. The smallest level of geography are what are called census blocks. Those are those green lines on the right. They can, but do not necessarily mean the same thing as a city block. Sometimes they will be the exact same as a city block. Sometimes they will be bigger. Sometimes, as you can see in rural areas, they will be significantly bigger. But those are the blocks that the census provides data in. And as, again, general rule, you have to use those. So you don't want to split those blocks because that's the data that they provide. So those are, in the case of Chico, 1,400 little moving pieces that we're going to assemble and divide up to create 7 different districts. The next step above those are what are called census block groups. Those are the blue lines now on the screen. They are a step bigger. Census blocks add up to make a census block group, so they will align with each other. So it's not like a census block group will split a census block. The reason census block groups are important is, as I mentioned before, the census does a count every 10 years, but the census doesn't just go to sleep in the time in between. They're actually continuing to survey the American public every month of every year, and they do that for what's called the American Community Survey. The American Community Survey is updated every year. The good thing about the American Community Survey is A, it's more current, and B, they ask a lot more questions that are in the census. So the census is really just asking who lives here, how many people live here, how old are they, what's their race, ethnicity. That's kind of all the census asks. The American community asks stuff like, how many bathrooms do you have? When did you buy your house? How much income do you have? What's your travel time to get to work? All these hundreds and thousands of variables. The bad thing about the American Community Survey is the smallest level of geography they report at is the census block group, so those blue lines. The other thing is it's an estimate. They don't ask everyone. They only ask a subset, so there's an inherent margin of error in that. But again, if you wanted to look at things like, where is the concentration of renters in the city? That's where we would be able to see some of that data using those. So that's where block groups may come up as we work our way through the process. The next layer, and I won't linger on these red lines, which are solid census tracts. They are much bigger than block groups. As you can see, we went from 1,300 blocks to 86 block groups to just 25 census tracts. Some of the data from that American Community Survey is only available at the tract level, which is why that might pop up. But generally, most data most people want to use is available at that block group level. The other piece of geographies I'll mention are slices. These are based on those census blocks and census block groups. They're actually something, though, that I create based on those because the block groups tend to be too big to put together district boundaries, and 1,400 little pieces tends to overwhelm members of the public who want to draw their own maps, because that's a lot of Lego pieces to put together. So that's why we create the slices. So if people want to draw their own maps in a somewhat accessible way, they can use those slices to divide up the city. With the next council meeting next Tuesday, the city will be publishing some additional tools for people who do want to draw their own maps, both a physical paper packet, so similar to what you have before you. So you can literally draw on there and add up the numbers and say, I want that to be a district, I want that to be a district, I want that to be a district. The other tool that'll be up is an Excel spreadsheet where you'll just go through and say, slice 1 should be in 1, slice 2 should be in 4, slice 3 should be in 5, and just assign every slice to a district. You can submit those materials, and then if you do submit your own plans, we'll treat them exactly the same way as a plan that I draw. So they'll be digitized, we'll give them the city council the exact same statistics, the exact same maps. I treat any public map as being equal to my own. So that's the way we will work through that process so that, again, your elected officials have the most and the best thinking of everyone to inform this process. The other piece of geography I will mention are precincts. Precincts are administrative geography that are used by your county registrar of voters in order to administer the election. It is the level of geography where they report both voter registration data and election result data. This is where people start getting a little nervous because they're like, why are you looking at election data? Is this some conspiracy to, gerrymander districts? The reason we build that data, and I build that for every jurisdiction, whether they ask me to or not, is that you actually have to use that data when you're looking at the Federal Voting Rights Act and whether those issues apply. So that's why we build it, to look at those issues. After that, I just kind of put it in a drawer until we get direction from council as far as how they want the district lines put together, what are those kind of markers that they give me, but that's why it's built out and why it exists in the first place. I'll also note you may have overlapping other jurisdiction boundaries. That is something that you don't have, but can consider. Whether you think, for example, your school district boundaries make sense, and if that boundary makes sense or not. Again, those are all optional items that exist, but don't necessarily need to be used. So things to remember as we go through: districts need to be relatively of the same size. When they're not of the same size, there should be a reason why. Are there reasons why they shouldn't be the same size? Absolutely. The absolutely equal size? Absolutely. When you're looking at traditional redistricting criteria, whether you're trying to keep the districts compact, whether you're trying to honor a community of interest, whether you're trying to honor a piece of topography, lots of reasons why. Race shouldn't be a predominant factor. It can be a factor in, for example, looking at a community of interest. There are lots of other reasons why you look at why a community of interest may be a community beyond just race. And then again, just be aware of the timeline. This is going to be a very short, quick process to get through. and then you'll get to do it all again. So really quickly on next steps, as I mentioned, the city has set up a website, on the main website, a page dedicated to this item. The next hearing of the council will be December 10th. That will be the meeting where they will continue to gather testimony from the public and where they'll give preliminary direction to me about things they want to see in the first round of draft maps. So if you want to continue to participate in that process, that's a date to circle on your calendar. If you want to submit testimony, they have submitted or set up a dedicated email account specifically for this process on the screen. After that second hearing, I will go and I will draw at least 3 maps. Sometimes it's more, just depending on what the direction from the council is and how many maps I determine I need to show them all those options. But at least 3 maps plus any publicly submitted maps. Those will be published in late December. Those maps may look radically different from each other. So one map, it's not like going to be like 3 variants of the same thing, because some places there might be a trade-off of, if you do this, you can't do that. If you do that, you can't do this. So here's those 2 options. Which one is better, which is worse? That's where the third hearing will come into play, which will be January 7th. That's where the council will look at those maps. The public will look at those maps. Some of them they'll say, oh, that's great. Some of them will say, what were you on when you drew that? And that's fine. Hopefully what they'll do there is they'll start settling on maybe one map that they like best, or maybe a hybrid of 2 maps that they like best, and also identify some things that are really good about those maps, and maybe some things that are close but not quite right and need to be addressed. That's why there'll be a second round of map drawing, which will happen in mid-January. So then I'll come back with up to 3 maps, potentially more, depending on the direction from council. Those maps will look a lot more like each other. Those will be variants of each other as opposed to radically different maps. Council will look at those on January 21st. Hopefully one of those maps will be one that can reach a consensus. If there's ones that are really close but need a little tweaking, we can actually do those changes live at that January 21st meeting, so that hopefully out of that January 21st meeting there's a map identified that can be used, so that myself and city staff can go through the process of preparing an ordinance for adoption in February. So for purposes of this phase 1 and where we are now, and any testimony members of the public are thinking about submitting, there are 2 kind of main categories of testimony that are particularly helpful at this stage. The first being, what are those communities of interest? If you're talking about a community of interest, where is it located? Remember, I'm not from here, so you may be like, oh, how do you not know where Chapman is? I'm sorry. But telling me where those are, and particularly saying where the boundaries of that, right? Because your definition of that neighborhood may not be the same as your neighbor's definition of that neighborhood. Why is it why is it a community of interest? What are the interests that tie it together? And why is it important to be kept together for purposes of representation? Those are your 3 bullets if you're submitting community of interest testimony. If you want to talk about the process more broadly, laid out a lot of different criteria, a lot of different priorities. Again, this involves trade-offs. Providing direction and input to council as far as which of those priorities you think are most important. Where are those pressure points? If there is a pressure point, which way should those be resolved? So those are the kind of input that will be particularly helpful to your elected decision makers. Before we go to questions, I'm going to tab off for half a second, so bear with me. And first, again, I'm showing on the screen here the city website that has been dedicated, where you'll see those materials about the process. You'll also see materials that can be used, including, for example, these are the materials that are in your packet. This will be also where those tools to submit your own plans will be posted. So this is your one-stop shopping for redistricting here in Chico. And then lastly, I will show the interactive redistricting software we're going to be using for this process. So you'll see this particularly in council meetings, where this is software where we can zoom in, We can add layers, we can hide layers to kind of show people through the process. One thing for everybody who was at the first council meeting that has been added is your city staff diligently went through their old files, and I think it was about 10 years ago, the city did go through a process of trying to identify some of the neighborhoods in the city. And so that has been added here. You can see those popping up. If that looks like a lot of information right now, the good news is that map, that information has been posted to the website. There's going to be another copy of it that we'll post after today, so people can look at those. Those may be right. Those may be wrong. I don't know. But it is at least some information that is available. So if you wanted to look at what kind of pre-existing data is available, to be clear, and I just want to emphasize, the city council has provided no direction whether this should be used or not, whether this should guide the process or not. It's just something that has been added to all of the other baseline maps, which I believe are also in the packet here. I know are also on the website, that have things like school enrollment zones and all this other data. Is just the one thing that has been added since that first hearing, so I did want to make sure to point it out to folks. With that, again, I will go back to the main presentation. I'm, again, happy to answer questions about process, happy to answer questions about the kind of the law and data that'll guide this process. If you have thoughts about how the line should be, I am not the person to be lobbying. And with that, you have city staff here. We'll just do this as a raise of hands and take questions. If you are asking a question, I know staff distributed speaker cards. I know they want to gather that because they do want to create a record of everybody who participated. So either turn in that speaker card, or if you did not, after your question, make sure you grab one before you leave so they have that. And with that, I can take a breath. Questions? Did I bore you all and put you to sleep? There's a question over there. Well, go 1 second so we have the mic, so then, because we're recording this, so that everybody can hear that who might be watching later.
Ken Fleming, how did you, the chart that shows the slices, how did you determine the slices? As one question. The second is the Excel spreadsheet attached anyway to a map? So as you do it, you can actually see what you're coming up with.
So the slices are based primarily, and we'll go back a step, on these block groups. So I start with the block groups here, which are those blue lines. The issue with the blue lines is sometimes the block groups actually do not follow your city boundaries. So you'll have a block group that'll be in 3 non-contiguous pieces. So that is would be a little confusing for people. So I have to correct for that issue. And then in a couple of places, particularly for a city that has 7 districts, for a district city that might have 4, the block groups are just too big. So you have some of the block groups I think have like 5,000 people in them. And if you think you're trying to draw a district with 12,000, that doesn't give you a lot of flexibility. So where we have those very large block groups, I will split those in half. When I do that, I look for a major piece of topography, and that's what I'll use as the dividing for the slices. For the tools, the software doesn't color in the district, so you would have to keep track of what you are using. It does have a map attached to it, so you could print out that map and kind of check. What usually when people do it is they'll print out a hard copy of that map, and they'll just kind of color in as they do it, and then they'll fill in the spreadsheet. And it does all the math for you. It just doesn't actually color in the map.
Thank you.
Any other questions? If not, I'll see you next Tuesday.
Thank you for all this information. I have a question like Ken's on slices. So you've described all of these various kind of layers of granularity, and I'm curious, as people in the community are drawing their own maps, is it correct that if you base your lines on slices, you know, I don't know what the term would be, have the best a chance to come up with something reasonable, or should the lines be based on either another criteria or always use multiple?
Yeah. So the short answer is the slices are not designed, do not limit the process. The blocks do. So we have to use the blocks. We can't split those. So if a member of the public wanted to go through the process of splitting or drawing a district with all 1,300 blocks, they absolutely can. And if they submitted, here's my, let's call it a block assignment file for that, for here how I'd like to assign all those, I'll digitize that in exactly the same way. The only reason I have done the slices, and this is based on experience in other jurisdictions, is I generally tend to find I get fewer public submissions if I only provide the tools based on the blocks, because it just overwhelms. People are a little bit more casual about the process. One thing I will note, if somebody submits a map based on the slices and somewhere the slices are impeding their process, there is a note section in there, so they can put in a note saying like, slice 89 really should be split in half, and then we'll go through that information. So it is a little limiting for people. It is a balancing act of overwhelming people versus providing them flexibility.
Hi, sorry. The timeline on the city's website's a little different than the one you put up. Is this available? Is this slideshow available online?
I believe they posted the slide, the PowerPoint from the first city council meeting online, so that is up there, and this is basically the same PowerPoint, with the exception of the community meeting wasn't in there because the council hadn't directed it. And for people there, you know, it took a little while for them to figure out exactly when they were going to have it. So if there's a discrepancy, if you point that out to staff at the end of the meeting, then we'll get that corrected, because there shouldn't be one.
It's unclear when the deadline for the communities of interest stuff is. When is the deadline for that? So
ideally, all community of interest testimony will be submitted by the next council meeting on the 10th. 10th. The community of interest, because then people start drawing lines based on that. So we want everybody to have that information. If it's submitted later, it can still be used. But if it's going to be considered for purposes of that first round of line drawing, that's when it needs to be submitted. For the public map, so if you're submitting your own map of an actual redistricting plan, that's a later date that I believe is December 19th, I believe. So that could be the discrepancy. If not, again, we'll verify with staff.
Yeah, on the city's website, it's pretty straightforward of when the meetings are, and that's it. It doesn't provide any deadline, so that helps. So the 10th for communities of interest, and the 19th you said for draft maps. And then you, at the very end, you said you were not the person to talk to and petition. Who is that person?
So if you want to encourage the city to draw particular lines, that is your elected officials. So the options in which to do that would be to submit public testimony either in advance through the email account I referenced earlier, through a hard copy, including either your own written submission, or if you wanted to use one of the tools such as the community of interest tool, or the map drawing tool once it's available, or to actually attend the council meeting next week.
Okay, yeah, and the council meeting last week, which took public input, it's the standard 3 minutes. It doesn't allow a dialogue. And is there going to be a time for that?
That's probably going beyond my scope as far as how they plan on structuring that public hearing.
Okay, and then thank you for your patience. Lastly, I just wanted to encourage you to consider also looking at there's some stormwater maps that kind of show watersheds. And watershed democracy is an idea that goes to John Wesley Powell and the Settlement of the West. Something definitely to consider as you look at other layers. And that map's on the city's website.
So that is good direction. That is something I will mention for members of the public. If there's data that you think should be considered and available to your elected officials at the next meeting, identifying those so that we have those available should those elected officials decide that that's something to consider. So as watershed data, I will add that to my homework list.
Yeah, sure. And I can email you the link and stuff like that.
One thing I encourage is email staff, not me, because I don't do ex parte.
The district elections email address. Thank you.
Got a couple hands over there. Whoever she gives the mic to, I guess. Got to get the mic to you first.
Thank you. I don't have a question so much as a comment, and maybe it's my failing eyesight as I get older, but I find it really hard to decipher these maps. You take for example, the one dealing with ethnicity. There's nothing to be seen there because it's just all these little dots. And is there any way that you can create these maps on a larger scale, like at one of these workshops, have a big old map so that we can see them a little bit more clearly?
So there's two parts to that answer, and one is that the maps that if you look on the website, actually, they are actually designed that they can be printed on tabloid, which is twice as big as those maps. So if you wanted to print any of those baseline maps yourself at a larger size, that is available on the website. That is also for purposes of the council meeting on the 10th. That's why we have that interactive software available to the council. So, and for their deliberations. So, if they wanted to, say, zoom in to an area to be able to see something with more granular information, that's just a point and click kind of interface. The other part I will note is that on the city website, there is actually in addition to the static maps like in there are as a Google map, which is an interactive map like this where you can zoom in. It does not have everything in there, but it does in specific have those slices in there. So if you wanted to see exactly what the boundaries of those slices are and you wanted to see the statistics for those, that is there so people can actually zoom in to their heart's content.
Okay.
I live in my home is located in the area that is represented by the Chico Avenues Neighborhood Association. We only have a few days to pull together some sort of first draft. Actually, our first chore, I guess, is to determine how much of our neighborhood association is actually going to be in one or more districts, likely. Given the time frame, I don't know how big a group we can pull together to look at this, but I'm sure at least our board of directors will be interested in sitting down and doing something. And I'm wondering, since you're out of the area, I'm wondering if Chico city staff that are following this closely would be available to work with an organization like ours. Well,
I'll start by saying that actually if you had a first task, it would be verifying what the boundaries are of that, identifying that homeowners association is in fact representative of a community of interest. What are the boundaries of that homeowners association, and are they accurately represented? I believe the neighborhood map that the staff put together previously, that was one of the items they looked at when they were putting that together, is where there was a homeowners association. They considered that. So that would be something I would start with, to seeing if that is in fact accurate or if that is dated information, so that we have that key building block there. As far as actually putting together a plan, I will defer to your staff and perhaps talking to them after the meeting as far as any available additional resources you may require in order for them to help facilitate the process.
Thank you.
Yeah, my question's about once the maps are drawn and the districts are drawn up, about the sequencing of elections. Can you talk a little bit about, you alluded to some of the factors that go into that, is figuring which districts would vote first. Do you make recommendations on that based on the data that you look at, or is that something that's left entirely up to the elected officials?
It is generally, there's very little guidance about sequencing in either federal or state law. Really the only thing that speaks to sequencing is that one provision of the California Voting Rights Act. So beyond that, that is a place where the council will have some flexibility. Generally sequencing issues, we start dealing with really in particular that fourth meeting, which is where at that point, once you kind of have a map, then you can start figuring out where those are. I will identify any jurisdictions that, based on both my read of the demographics and your city councils, SEL councils, input, that we would suggest probably should go first.
Okay. And then how is that? Is that, I assume it's put into some type of a report or some type of a finding that's made?
It'll be in the staff report, correct?
Okay. All right. Thank you.
All righty. How quickly did we get done? An hour. There you go. It's not a formal meeting, so I don't have a gavel or anything, so